Welcome back to Tabletop Titans and another Titan Tactics. Melee, or close combat, is one of the most important aspects of Warhammer 40k, and mastering it is going to be the key to victory. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a few ways to get the most out of it and to mitigate what your opponent can do. Let's dive on in and take a look. Of course, if you do enjoy this content, do consider liking and subscribing. Hit that button down below. We greatly appreciate it. Let's take a look. So of course we say melee because there are multiple phases that are going to impact how you can do in close combat. Of course, movement positioning is going to affect the charge phase, which is going to affect the fight phase, which is going to affect the morale phase. So all of these things are very much interconnected, but let's start with the fundamentals with the charge phase. Of course, in the charge phase, you have hopefully formed your plan on where you're going to be charging in, and there's a few things that are going to inform that. First of all, how many targets are you charging? I mean this in a couple of senses. Are you charging multiple units with one of your units? Are you charging multiple units into multiple other combats? All these things are going to increase or decrease the risk of the following combat. So there are a few things to consider when going into the charge phase. How many charges do you need to make? How many fights are you going to be engaging in? This means a couple of things. It is going to increase or decrease the possible risk and response of your opponent, and it's also going to give you more opportunities depending on how many locations you're charging in. So, are you charging in with a single unit into multiple enemy units? Are you charging multiple of your units into multiple of their units? Both these situations are going to create this risk and reward that you need to be able to balance. Of course, consider how much melee threat you're actually bringing to the table and be realistic. Think about it in your head, do a bit of quick mental math. How likely are you to wipe out a unit? How likely are they to have a response? And where is the biggest threat possible? Of course, you don't want to overcommit, but there are other advantages to engaging more units than one, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Of course, the biggest thing to consider is where your opponent is likely to interrupt. There's, of course, the counteroffensive stratagem, which is 2 command points to allow your opponent to fight immediately with a unit after you have fought with 1 unit. So when you have a single combat, it's going to be very clear. You have total control over that situation. But if you're willing to open up to more opportunities, more combats, they are going to then be able to interrupt back into you. So we need to mitigate that as much as possible. There are a number of other tools that your opponent is going to have available to them, so let's take a look at what they are and how to mitigate them. A big one to consider, of course, when going into the charge phase is, does your opponent have any heroic interventions? I would recommend literally taking some dice and measuring out 3 inches away from their characters and being sure to stay outside of the heroic intervention range. Of course, ask your opponent, do they have access to other heroic interventions? Do they have access to longer interventions? I'm not saying that you should never put yourself within range, because sometimes it can be interesting to bait your opponent into actually allowing you to fight a character you couldn't otherwise charge, but by and large, those characters are there for a reason, and it's to prevent you from charging. Additionally, you're going to want to see, does your opponent have access to any fight last or fight on death? Feel free to ask them and see if they have any access to it. Of course, both of these change the math in a couple of ways. Up till now, we're looking at, does your opponent have the ability to interrupt with 2 command points? First of all, check if they do. If they don't, you're good on that front. But fight last and fight on death are going to shake this up in an additional way, because really, we're looking at where can you strike first with a unit, wipe them out, and remove the response. If they have fight on death, they're going to still immediately get that response, and you really need to consider if that is worth it or not. And of course, tougher units are going to do better in these situations, and the more fragile units are likely to be the first to fight with. Another major tool that your opponent has in the charge phase is, of course, Overwatch. Now, there are 2 primary ways of dealing with Overwatch. One, you can charge that unit out of line of sight, and most weapons will not be able to shoot at them. So you can charge from behind a piece of obscuring terrain, you can charge behind something that just simply blocks a line of sight normally. That is, of course, one way. Sometimes it is worth taking a longer charge in order to avoid that Overwatch. You just need to balance that risk versus reward about how many models you are likely to lose from that Overwatch. Another, perhaps more reliable way, is to have a separate unit, a less desirable unit to Overwatch, charge in first. This can take the shape of a cheap throwaway unit that you don't care if they die, or it can also take the shape of a tougher unit that your opponent is just not optimized to go into. So for example, transports are great for this. If you have a lot of small arms fire that is actually going to do damage to your infantry, they can hop out, get ready to charge, and you charge in their transport, their truck, their rhino, what have you. And your opponent just might not overwatch because it's not an interesting target. That unit is now locked up, they cannot overwatch the unit that you are actually charging in, and you're good to go. So those are a couple ways to deal with Overwatch, which is honestly a big thing to consider when looking at your charges. And of course, beyond these tools, consider what is the overall goal. Remember that killing here is only a means to an end. You're trying to get movement, you're trying to get objectives, you're trying to block your opponent's movement, and at a very last resort, you're trying to kill your opponent's models, and likely this is because it's connected to its secondary. So consider all this positioning when you're in the charge phase before you even begin those charges, and consider how you get there in the movement phase. Of course, let's talk about something that we are all notoriously bad about, which is determining how reliable a charge is. Let's take a look at these percentages, and I think some of them are going to be a bit shocking when you actually look at them. As you can see here, a 9-inch charge is only a 28% chance of success. This is of course before rerolls, but it is quite low. We all have some sense of how likely you are to make a 9-inch charge, and I'll be honest, it feels like it's more likely than this, but it's not. So really only use these 9-inch charges as a last resort. You can see here, of course, a 7-inch charge is in your favor, just slightly, clocking in at 58%, and there's a steep increase or decrease on either side of it. This means that pluses and minuses to charge are going to have a huge impact on your ability to deliver your units in. So keep this mental math in mind when you're evaluating which charges. And frankly, this will help you determine which charges to start with. Which charge is the most essential for you to make, and which is the most risky. And consider, is this the same charge, and which one should you start with, so that you can know if you have your command point reroll to use later on in the charge phase. Now that we've delivered our units into combat, it is time to take a look at the fight phase. The first question of the day is always, which units should you activate first? Let's start with the basics. Of course, units that have the fight first ability will generally fight first. If you're a charging unit, you'll have the fight first ability. If you have another ability such as Mark of Slaanesh, you'll also have fight first. These units are going to activate first, starting with the players whose turn it is. So the active player starts, and then if your opponent has fight first, they then get to respond next, and you alternate back and forth. Then we have the normal combats or the ongoing combats. If you had something that was going on from a previous turn and you're all still in melee, you're also going to alternate after the fight first, but this time you're going to start with the player whose turn it is not. And so this is really important when you're looking at making those charges. Don't forget, those ongoing combats, your opponent is going to have the first chance to respond. So how can you deliver a fight last ability into there, or how can you simply deliver another unit that now has fight first into your opponent's unit? Last of all, of course, fight last, starting with the player whose turn it is not. These people have an ability that prevent them from fighting normally, and obviously don't have fight first. So having established that basic order of operations on fighting first, and fighting last, let's take a look. Where should you start? Look at the layout of the table, look at where the enemy models are. Do they have somewhere that they can really hurt you if they fight before you? Conversely, do you have a unit that's going to be very fragile but very killy, and you need to make sure you get your activation in? Tougher units are likely to not be the first priority for this, obviously. And also consider, is there an objective or secondary that you really need? So you're balancing this. The melee output of your unit, the melee durability of your unit, and your scoring capability based off of if your opponent will have a chance to respond. So all these complicated things considered, where do you activate first? As we mentioned, a big part of close combat has nothing to do with actually killing things, but it has everything to do with movement, board control, and holding objectives. So you want to take a look. Is there somewhere where you can use additional movement to get to where you need to go? When a unit is selected to fight, you actually get to move twice. You get to make a 3-inch pile-in when you first are activated, and then you get to make a 3-inch consolidation move after you're done fighting. Both of these moves have to be at least closer to the closest enemy model than they started. Now this means a couple of interesting things. First of all, this means that if your model and your opponent's model are physically base to base, you cannot make a pile-in or a consolidation move because you cannot physically move any closer to the closest enemy model than you already are. This can be used both for you and against you. This can prevent movement by your opponent, so it could be worth actually piling in and physically tagging up their models. This opens up a new concept, the concept of tagging. In competitive 40K, we talk about tagging particularly when we are trying to get into engagement range of a unit we have not charged. If you don't declare them as a charge target, you can't fight them, you can't kill them, you can't really do anything to them. But you are able to move in engagement range with them, which you couldn't do in the charge phase. When doing so, balance your risk and reward, of course. They're going to be able to fight, they're going to be able to pile in, they're going to be able to consolidate, but are you going to be able to prevent them from shooting next turn? Are you going to be able to prevent them from advancing next turn or performing actions? All these things can potentially make it worthwhile as long as you're able to survive the return fire or return combat from that enemy unit. So that's the thing to consider. Additionally, you can get extra movement onto objectives or screening your opponent. So this pile-in and this consolidate are going to be very important in order to deliver your models where they need to be and block out your opponent's models and really just get in their way. If this is going to cause a big problem for your opponent, strongly consider doing it, even if it is a bit risky. So we talked about tagging. Let's talk about the concepts of wrapping and tri-pointing. Wrapping is pretty self-explanatory. This is the process by which you take your units and you surround or you wrap your opponent's units, making it impossible for them to move or escape. Remember that unless you have the fly keyword or a similar rule, you cannot move through friendly or enemy models. So if you can fully surround them, they are going to be trapped. The only way they can move, of course, is if they perform a desperate breakout, which is a risky and costly stratagem by which they can actually lose additional models after their move. Of course, if you don't give them anywhere to go, even while moving through your models, then you can completely prevent this desperate breakout altogether and have them completely pinned. This means that your unit cannot be shot at or interacted with in a number of different ways, and you're going to be well positioned to then fight first in their following fight phase. So that's key. That's the concept of wrapping. But what is tri-pointing? It's something we talk about a lot in competitive play, but it's not always clear. Well, tri-pointing is the act of pinning down and wrapping a single model. Of course, the way that you geometrically surround a circle with other circles is by surrounding it at 3 points that are equidistant from each other. This makes it so that the other circle is not able to move without moving through another enemy's base. You don't have to be incredibly precise with this, but you do need to make sure that it's clear with your opponents that you have tri-pointed them, that they cannot physically move their model. So we'll always double check because while we're not going to be physically able to actually set up 3 bases in an equilateral triangle, it's important that your opponent knows what your intent is here and that individual minutiae are not as important. But if you're able to pull this off, it's very powerful, it's very important because it'll force them to do a desperate breakout, or they're just going to be caught in combat. And if you can force more than one of these, then they're going to have to choose which one escapes and which one stays in combat. Of course, there is one other way that your models can be moved during the fight phase. And this is, of course, by dying. This is something that's going to happen during the fight phase. It's inevitable, y'all, but you can use it to your advantage. As we mentioned, when a model is base to base, you cannot move, you cannot pile in, you cannot consolidate. So it's interesting to see if your opponent is fighting before you, what models can you pull to then unlock additional movement when it's time for you to move. Vice versa, if your opponent is going into you, you can start plucking models from the front of your ranks. That's going to make it harder for them to reach all their models in combat and reduce that counterattack or that countercharge in following turns or following combats. So you can really weaponize and use this to your advantage. Additionally, of course, you are going to lose models to morale. This is a great way to actually mitigate this tri-point here, where if you have a single model that is surrounded and is just a single model, it can be very useful to fail a key save or to fail morale and make sure you pluck that singular model. I can't tell you how many times I've actually hoped to fail morale in order to be able to break out of a combat and have the model that was pinned down be able to run out away and free up the rest of the unit to fight. So as you can see, we're starting to transition to talking about how do you defend against these tactics rather than how to use them yourselves. These are all the same tactics that your opponent's going to have available to them. So how do you respond? Well, there's a few things. Always keep in mind the threat ranges of your opponents. Look at how far they can move. Can they advance and charge? How far can they charge? Do they have any extra long pile-in or consolidations? And always keep those in mind, map them out, and really respect what is possible for your opponent if they roll super, super high. There's nothing worse than losing a game off some bad dice rolls or some lucky dice rolls, and so you want to keep an eye on that. Know, of course, where you are most susceptible to your opponent charging in, and consider setting up some defenses there. You can screen out by having cheaper units blocking. You could have a counter charge or a long heroic intervention within range to make it a little less appealing for your opponent to actually charge in there. Fight Last is a great counter charge tool to keep nearby susceptible units as well, and consider saving 2 command points for the interrupt stratagem, which is counteroffensive. It's huge, huge, huge. Your opponent is going to be trying to have you spend command points, so you don't have enough for that, so always keep that in mind as a very, very valuable stratagem. And of course, as much as Overwatch is a pain to charge into, make sure you're positioned to use it against your opponent. Don't let them charge out of line of sight. Don't let them charge in with those transports or other pesky units. So keep that in mind, and maybe even take those units out so they don't have them to use to negate your own Overwatch. And finally, of course, make sure that you're making favorable trades when your opponent is coming in. You can try to bait them out. We just mentioned about heroic intervention ranges and all that good stuff. Invite them in to their combats. Make sure that it's going to be surprisingly favorable for you as they try to press the advantage onto your side of the table. Now, we know this is a lot to consider, so keep these things in mind and don't be too harsh on yourself. The best way to get a hang on this is to start practicing them. You can come watch the video, check out the key points, and of course, just keep playing, and this is going to be a little bit different for each army you play. So definitely just keep on it and keep practicing. This is all about your charge phase positioning. It's all about balancing your risk versus reward. It's all about evaluating your opponent's tools, and it's also all about mitigating your opponent's response. How can you get what you need to get done, and how do you prevent your opponent from doing the same back to you? Of course, let us know if you have any other tips and tricks to use in the fight phase or the charge phase. There's a ton more to discuss, so we're always eager to hear your thoughts on the matter. That's going to do it for me. I'll catch you all next time on the tabletop. Bye!